If you're a garment sewer, I'm sure you're more than aware of how quickly fabric scraps and leftovers can start to pile up. Your fabric scraps contain so much creative potential though, but you need some strategies in place so they don't overwhelm you. If you don't have a system or strategy in place, then Check Your Thread is here to help. In this episode, we hear from Check Your Thread listeners who share what scraps they keep, how they store them, and what they use them for. You can then use these responses to form your own scrap strategies and solutions. So stick around a few minutes for that. Welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 15 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge We Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis, and I'm looking at the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes, whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. How are you doing today, lovely listener? I'm recording this on Sunday, which is Mother's Day here in the UK. It's also a couple of days after International Women's Day. I want to send love and strength to every woman across the globe, particularly those in some kind of caring role. And let's be reminded that it's not only okay, but in fact it's essential to take some time to care for ourselves and do what we want and need to do sometimes, including sewing. We need to take some time to rest and re-energise from time to time so we can continue to fight against inequality in all its forms. So, have you been giving yourself some time to sew lately? Over the last week or so, I've been using my sewing skills to make World Book Day costumes for my kids, and I've been sewing for money, which is making some samples for work. To be honest, these are not my favourite uses of my skills and time, but needs must. So sustainability wins. Well, I'm going to claim my kids' World Book Day costumes as those this week. My son wanted to be the cartoon character Lushkin, who is a blue cat. I made him a tracksuit out of the old school jumpers from my kids' previous school, and I made my husband make a papier-mâché mask. If you saw my rant on Instagram this week, you'll know that I pretty much resent making costumes and items that are only going to see one or two wears. So I made the tracksuit top and bottoms so that they can be worn as regular clothes going forward. My daughter wanted to be another comic character called Primer, and we sourced everything that she wore from a charity shop and from her own wardrobe. Literally the only things we bought for the costumes were some paint for the mask and some coloured hairspray for the Primer character. Another sustainability win this week was making a draft excluder for my friend, which is filled with fabric scraps. Hopefully it'll help her stay warmer in her drafty flat, and it helped me keep some of my scraps out of landfill or some other unknown fate. At least for as long as my pal keeps draft excluder anyway. Sustainability fails. I'm probably responsible for some this week, but it's Mother's Day, so I'm going to let myself off the hook this week. However, this week I get to say huge thanks to new patrons, Olivia, Yaelin, Ava Maria, Tony and Julianne. They all signed up to support the podcast via Patreon in the last 7 days, and I'm very, very grateful. And I also get to say huge thanks to existing patrons Lisa and Rachel, who so kindly upped the amount of their monthly support. This podcast is not a solo endeavour, it is a community. It couldn't happen without the patron support. It couldn't happen without awesome ideas and the lovely supportive messages that you send in. And community episodes like the one you're about to hear, well, they would simply be silent if it wasn't for you sending in your thoughts and experiences. I'm so honoured to receive the support in all its forms so that we can continue to explore these themes. If you're in a position where you could spare a small monthly contribution to help cover costs, then please find the Patreon link in the show notes in your podcast app right now or on the website checkyourthread.com. And if you can't afford to make a financial contribution at this time, no problem. Perhaps you could do me a solid by sharing your favourite episode of the podcast with a sewing buddy or via social media. Getting the podcast some new ears is also a wonderful way to help support this whole endeavour. Oh, super quick message for patrons. The March mending meetups, which are going to take place via Zoom, have been scheduled now. So check your inbox or the Check Your Thread page on the Patreon app for the details so you can join in. Okay, today's episode. So this is the first of 3 that will form what I'm calling the Fabric Scraps mini-series. So the episode you're about to hear and the following one are a deep dive into fabric scraps and strategies for processing and using them. My goal for these episodes is to help you work out systems that are going to work for you. so you can get the most out of what you own, but in a way that's compatible with your specific circumstances and interests. I've drilled down on a lot of the issues that people have when it comes to scraps, and I've distilled those into 4 questions. Then I pose those questions to Check Your Thread listeners. By hearing from different people about what they do and why, the hope is that some will resonate with you, and by the end of this mini-series, you'll have a plan and a system in place that works for you. And then, the 3rd episode in the mini-series, that is specifically about making garments from scraps and leftovers. In that episode, I'll be sharing everything I've learned through my own explorations and following others doing similar stuff. And there'll be a downloadable guide that's going to accompany that 3rd episode. But I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on this mini-series, so don't be shy. Please find me on Instagram @checkyourthread, or you can email me zoe@checkyourthread.com. So there's not a ton in the show notes today, but do go to checkyourthread.com to sign up to the free weekly newsletter if you haven't already. The sign-up box is at the bottom of the homepage. So please take care of yourself and your loved ones and the wider global community, and then go back round and take care of yourself some more. And enjoy! Every garment sewer who's been sewing for more than 5 minutes will be aware of how easily fabric scraps and leftovers pile up. In fact, unless we're using a 0 or minimal waste sewing pattern, then usually at least 15% of the fabric length will be left over when we cut out a sewing pattern. Fabric scraps and leftovers, what to keep, what to do with them, how to store them. These are all topics that come up on the podcast over and over. And I think it's an issue that many of us haven't really solved for ourselves yet. So I feel it's time to have a bit of a deeper dive into the subject to really help you work out your own scrap strategies if you haven't already. First of all, a quick bit of defining. I'm talking about all the pieces of fabric, the sizable chunks, the weird shaped sections, the little annoying bits, and everything in between that remains once you've cut out a sewing project. Generally, for the purposes of this episode, I'm defining scraps as anything that's too small to cut out a complete small garment from. So why are we even talking about scraps? Don't you just cut out your sewing pattern and throw whatever's left in the bin? Hopefully not. These days, those of us who are more in tune with sustainability know that chucking fabric in a bin destined for landfill is not the way to go. In general, we need to be sending as little as possible to landfill anyway. Landfills release gases that contribute to climate change. They leach dangerous chemicals that contaminate local waterways, and they have been proven to be hazardous to the people who live and work near them. Plus, it's important to keep the resources that we've extracted from the earth in use for as long as possible. This is the principle of circularity, and we do this by keeping materials at the highest possible level of use. I talked to Shelley Summer about that and why it's important in episode 42, so I really recommend you go back and listen to that one, which gives all this a bit more context. Chucking scraps of virgin fabric in the bin will mean that those resources will have been chucked away before even being used once. So we need to keep everything, including our fabric scraps, out of the bin and in use for as long as possible. And if our fabric contains plastic, i.e. polyester, acrylic, elastane, nylon and so on, those are not going to biodegrade for hundreds and hundreds of years and will be doing all sorts of damage in the ground in the meantime. So it's arguably even more important to get the most out of those fibres and keep them out of the bin. But those can feel like pretty negative reasons for keeping hold of scraps and leftovers. Let's get into some more positive reasons for doing so. So I'm a firm believer that scraps and leftovers have a lot of potential use for us makers. In fact, I don't just believe it, I know it. I've made many projects in recent years, including entire garments, out of leftovers that I would have just chucked in the bin earlier on in my sewing career. And there is so much satisfaction to be had from using what otherwise might have been thrown away. The projects I make using scraps always make me flex my creativity in a way that is just so fun and leads to a real sense of accomplishment. So sewing is often portrayed on social media as quite a simple formula. Pick a sewing pattern, choose fabric that's suitable for it, make the project, maybe photograph it. The end. And there's definitely pleasure to be had in engaging in such a sewing project. But sometimes I want to scratch a different, more creative itch. So tweaking a project idea to make it fit what's around you, or piecing scraps together to make new, inverted commas, fabric, and then make something from that. These are such rewarding challenges, and honestly, some of the projects that I've ended up being the most proud of. If you don't believe me, then believe Judy Willamette-Ross, who regularly makes incredible pieces from the remains of previous projects. Listen to Judy talk about the subject in episodes 69 and 121 of the podcast. So, another aspect of working with scraps and leftovers that might not be felt by everyone is this. For me, saving and working with leftovers gives me a sense of connection with previous generations and indeed with people in different circumstances today, people for whom sewing resources weren't or aren't so abundant. So when I'm thinking about the G's Bent quilters, or seeing a patchworked house dress made during the Second World War, or hearing stories about my own great nan making clothes for her 9 kids, I'm so enthralled by the creativity and the skill of those makers in really difficult times. It reminds me that fabric is a precious resource and wonderful things can come when we treat it like it is. And there's also a strong financial case to be made. Say you bought 2 metres of denim at £15 per metre to make some jeans. After cutting out the pieces for those jeans, you'll be left with at least £4.50's worth of scraps. Now, wouldn't it be better to use that £4.50's worth of scraps for other fun projects, rather than effectively chucking the £4.50 in the bin? Looked at from another angle, making a project from the resources around you, in this case scraps, often feels, to me at least, like a free project. If you want to do some sewing during a time when funds are tight and a trip to the fabric shop isn't an option, it can be really satisfying to turn to the scraps and leftovers in your stash and create something cool with no financial outlay. But it's not just thriftiness and resourcefulness that are sources for enjoyment when working with scraps. There's also the fabrics themselves. If you chose the original lengths of fabric, then presumably you love and appreciate them. You pick them because you enjoy the colour, or the print, the texture, the drape, or whatever it is. So why wouldn't you want to include as much of what you bought as possible in your sewing projects? Then you'll have more items to use and enjoy that are made from the fabric that you love, not just the main garment that you initially bought the fabric for. And of course, we need to come back to the environmental impact. I obviously have to point out that fibre growth or production and spinning, then the fabric weaving or knitting, and the processing, dyeing, finishing and transportation, all of that is a very resource-hungry endeavour. Plus, it causes a lot of damage to soil, waterways and the air, therefore to workers, local populations and ecosystems. In short, fabric production has a high cost and wreaks a lot of damage. I don't point this out to make you feel guilty about the fabric that you want to sew with. I'm pointing it out to show that we have a responsibility to use as much of that fabric that we buy as possible. If we're discarding at least 15% of the fabric we buy when we sew, then at least 15% of the embedded resources are wasted. And at least 15% of that damage was caused for nothing. So, as we've acknowledged, scraps can build up rapidly and they take up our physical and mental space. So if we know it's not cool to chuck fabric in the bin, and we're excited to flex our creativity and get the most from the fabric we own, then we need some strategies for processing these scraps. So with the help of some lovely Check Your Thread patrons, I've drilled down on the main issues that people have related to fabric scraps. I've condensed those down into 4 questions. The questions are: what types and or sizes of fabric scraps should you keep? What is a good system for storing them? What do you do with the scraps that you're not going to keep? And what can you use fabric scraps for? Once you've got answers to these questions, you'll have a set of strategies for handling fabric scraps and they're less likely to feel overwhelming to you. However, I can't answer these questions for you. Every sewer is different. Our physical spaces, including storage, is different. Our mental and emotional capacities are different. The amount of free time we have differs. And our sewing interests and practical needs also differ. So I can't say keep all of your scraps if you live in a tiny flat with next to no storage. And nor can I say take up quilting to use up all your scraps if you have neither the time nor interest in doing so. You get my drift. So, in order to help you define your own answers, I've thrown these questions out to the Check Your Thread listener community and gathered up responses from people who have figured out their own scrap strategies. We're going to hear from them, either the voice notes that they've kindly sent in, or I'll read out their written responses. Some of these strategies will resonate with you more than others. By naturally gravitating to some, you'll hopefully be able to develop your own scrap strategies. So initially my plan was to try and divide all the voice notes and messages into 4 categories and answer each of the questions separately. But it quickly became clear that what people keep, how they keep them, and why they keep them are all so interconnected. So I'm just going to share each voice note and response as it is, and you will find inspiration within them. I'm going to share some of them today and some of them next week, along with a roundup. So to recap, I asked the lovely listener community to respond to the following prompts. What type and or size of fabric scraps do you usually keep? What is your system for storing them? What do you do with the scraps you don't keep? What are your favourite or most common uses for fabric scraps? So let's crack on with the answers to these burning questions.
Hi Zoe, this is Katie calling from near Buffalo, New York. I use my scraps for a lot of things. I do a lot of mending and a lot of upcycling. I love to take a boring shirt, for example, and replace the collar with something kind of fun, or even the sleeves or the cuffs. I am also always on the lookout for patterns that lend themselves to being pieced. So most recently, I made a Nest sweatshirt by So Liberated. I've also made a number of West End jackets. That's a free pattern from Peppermint magazine. I'd like to also recommend the Closet Core free poof pattern, so you can make it out of scraps and then you can stuff all your scraps that are not useful in other projects. So I'm looking forward to other ideas that your listeners send in. Anyway, I love the podcast. Okay, bye-bye.
Hi, my name's Beatrice and I live in Guildford in the southeast of England. I live in a very small flat with limited storage capacity, so I don't really like holding on to scraps. I'll usually keep any large leftover pieces of fabric if they're enough to make another garment with. I do dressmaking. I don't usually do bags or accessories or home goods. Even if I don't end up using those bigger pieces myself, I can put them into a fabric swap. With smaller leftover scraps, I usually want to keep a few bits and bobs for mending purposes. But once my leftovers bag is getting very full, it's overwhelming, and I usually donate to our local adult education supported learning team for their crafting and textile classes. That's an easy win for me because I work for Adult Ed, but for anybody else, I'm sure local schools, especially primary schools, would welcome spare crafting materials. Or maybe there's local charities that put on arts and crafts classes that might appreciate a bundle of fabric. I hope that helps. Cheers.
This is from Suzanne. Hi Zoe, I'm more of a quilter than a sewer of garments, but think I want to try making some clothing and do so as sustainably as possible, as well as use as much of my quilting fabric stash as possible without waste. What types and sizes of fabric scraps do I usually keep? Everything bigger than about 2 inches. Remember, I'm a quilter. I have see-through boxes of various sizes and store by colour, sort of. What do I do with the tiny bits? I make tiny scraps bunting, and if they are smaller than 1 inch and can't be used, I keep them to stuff puffy bunting, etc. And I love using scraps to make scrappy quilts.
Hello, Zoe. This is Sharon from Southern Connecticut, USA. My problem with scraps is that I never want to throw any of them away, so I've had to find ways to store them. Like all my fabrics, I keep my scraps in bins or baskets. Currently, I have 2 scrap bins, one for scraps the size of my hand up to half a yard, and the other for the smaller bits. I use my scraps for things like mending, small projects, baby bibs, coasters, and the like. Crazy quilting is fun, and kansashi flowers are a great use for using up small pieces. This spring, I am challenging myself to use all the scraps in one bin by sewing through the alphabet. A for apron or applique, B for bias binding or button covering, C for cuffs or coasters, and so on. My goal is to sew one item for each letter of the alphabet, use all the scraps, and stretch my creative muscle. We'll see how that goes. Thanks again for all you do for the sewing community.
Hello Zoe, this is Norma in Pantador in Wales. My scrap strategy is to keep most things. I do get rid of some shreds, and I compost anything that's reasonably compostable. They seem to disappear quite well. I make quilts out of scraps, and I've got a lot of wool scraps that I'm intending to make a waistcoat with. And I've got a lot of linen scraps, and I'm thinking maybe skirts, dresses. I've seen quite a few on Pinterest. So that's it from me.
This is from Susie. I keep scraps of everything, but I have different strategies for different types of fabric. For example, for drapey wovens, I keep anything large enough for a pocket lining or facing. For stable wovens, I would keep smaller pieces for patching and strips for bias tape and piping. Stretch jersey, I keep pieces that would be used for pants, the UK type, and also strips for neckbands and binding. 100% cotton jersey is useful for pants gussets. Thicker knits and sweatshirting scraps I find the hardest to use, so I tend to only keep pieces that could be something like a cuff or part of a multi-pieced design. I have very little space, so I can't keep everything. I try to keep like with like. I have a separate box for jersey bits, but everything else is with the stash fabric of the same type. I compost all of the natural fibre scraps I can't use, and anything with synthetic content goes to our local authority textile waste for shredding. I have 2 waste bins in the sewing room so I can separate out the natural fibres. I try to minimise the creation of scraps in the first place by buying fabrics specifically for projects, rather than speculatively buying lengths. And I buy the absolute minimum I think I can get away with, typically 30% less than a pattern calls for, and I only shop from places that sell in 10cm increments. Occasionally, I have to get creative with the cutting, but I've never once had a project fail because I didn't buy enough.
Hi, Zoe and Check Your Thread listeners. This is Janine Spendlove from the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm just recording a voice memo to let you know what I do with my scraps. I put them in 4 figurative, sometimes literal bins, and here they are. The ones that are large enough and in good enough condition, I keep to use for other projects. Many times I'll make cloth napkins, and it's also fun because you have these fun different fabrics that maybe you don't see every day because they're in an article of clothing you don't wear all the time. But if you have them on hand as cloth napkins that you're using all the time, you get to see your fun fabrics. The other things I like to use them for are like pocket facings, waistband facings, color blocking on different clothing articles and things like that. So there's a lot that you can do with bigger offcuts and scraps of fabric. For the smaller scraps, because I haven't quilted in over 20 years and I know I'm not going to quilt and I don't really have anybody who wants them, if they're really too small to be reused for anything else and they're not in good condition, if they're made of natural fiber, I put them in my compost bin. And if they're not made of natural fiber, I send them to a fabric recycling company that I trust called Retold Recycling. And so far, I've had great success with them. I probably send them 1, maybe 2 bags a year, like small trash can liner bags. Then the last bin or bag that I have is a bag of a scrap of fabric from every project I've ever done. And I keep this on hand in case I need to do mending, because I've had times where I've ripped something or just worn something out, or I even had a mouse that ate its way through some of my clothes and left giant quarter-sized holes. And so having the same fabric on hand so that I can do a patch that isn't probably going to be invisible, but at least is similar enough that it doesn't like stand out hugely for me. And that's what I do with my scraps. Hope you find it helpful.
Hi Zoe, it's Jenny here, or at Sew at Jenny. I have my current system. I've got a Kallax box in my unit, and that's for little scraps. That's anything where I could make a patchwork square out of it if I decide to make a quilt. But I have used some of those scraps of various sizes without cutting them down into a square. I've made a patchwork overlocker cover and a tote bag. So proper patchwork, very abstract, but I love it because I can see all the makes that I've made from that other pieces of fabric in the past. So it's quite cool. It's all just zigzag together. I think the bag had interfacing underneath just to stabilise it a bit. And then all my little scraps, including threads as well that cut off from the machine, I keep them in like a pillow-sized case, bag, sack, kind of to the side of my desk. So I chuck in all the little bits, you know, the bit where you've cut out a neckline, you have that weird semicircle, that all goes in there. And I'm now making a sewing machine cover. And I'm using something I saw on Instagram where you have a layer of cotton, a layer of organza. I've overlocked the edges to make like a little pocket or case, and I've stuffed it with all the threads and all these little colourful bits that I can't do anything with, and I'm going to quilt it. And then I've got a pocket piece for each side of the sewing machine cover, and hopefully I'll have a really cool quilted cover for my machine made up of all these little bits. And that's about what I do for my scraps, and it feels really good to have a purpose for all these little bits that aren't going straight into the bin.
It's from Liz Hayward, Australia. I'm in a different position from many in that I only made zero waste patterns for the last 4 years. I typically make 55 to 70 items per year. Believe it or not, I still create scraps, but way less than before, and they're a different type of scrap. They're more like offcuts, all in rectangular pieces of a good usable size, and are either the remainder of a length of stash fabric that I cut a garment from, or when I've had to buy fabric online in, for example, 25cm increments. I keep these in 2 50-litre bins, one for plains and one for prints, and I dip into them often for binding, pocket bags, small projects and the like. The plain fabrics I keep tied together in groups of colour. I also have a small separate collection of denim scraps that I use for visible mending, and a bag of floral scraps I've had for years for a maybe one day hexagon quilt. By the sewing machine there's a container for thread ends and trimmings which gets emptied into the stuffing collection bag. Just got to remember not to put any broken needles in there. The one thing that could be truly called scrap is when I straighten the end of the fabric or cut off the selvage. But I don't throw these strips out because they're so darn handy to have around the house, tying up tomato plants, holding back curtains, bundling together outgrown clothes to pass on to cousins, or anything that can be tied together instead of putting in a bag. Zero waste has definitely made a difference to both the quantity and type of scrap that I'm generating, but in ways that I didn't expect. Looking forward to listening to this episode, Zoe, and good luck with the Australian accent.
Hi Zoe, this is Steph from Chicago, sending in a message about fabric scraps. The types of fabric scraps I keep are anything left over from garment making that is a 1/4 yard or bigger, or any sizes that are smaller that can be used specifically in garment making. So selvages that can be used for stabilizing seams, or pieces of cotton or other wovens that can be used for pocketing fabrics. And I almost always have something left over, which is unfortunate because I am a buy the fabric first person. I love fabric. I buy it first, and sometimes I have too much. If I have enough left over, that's like enough to actually make another garment, I will try to make that garment at the same time. So if I'm making, say, a dress and I have enough left over for a small top, I will try and make that right away so it doesn't go back into my fabric collection. For my storing scraps, I have 2 bins, one a rather large bin for the bigger pieces, and then the second bin is what I call my pocketing fabric bin, and that's where all those pieces of pocketing fabric bins, and then any salvages that I keep, I put into my stabilizing bin. So these are plastic bins in my fabric closet. Ooh, what do I do with scraps that I don't keep? Feel like I'm a really bad person for this. So I filled a whole poof and I filled up a couple pillows. This was during the pandemic. And then I kept collecting scraps that I had no idea what to do with. And in a move, I unfortunately pitched them. And now in my flat that I own is smaller and small space. So I don't have a good solution. And I put them in the landfill. And every time I do it, I feel terrible. But keeping these scraps around in big piles doesn't feel right it just doesn't feel right. I need a better solution. I don't know if there is a better solution, but we'll see what other people are doing. So, greetings from Chicago, and I'm really, really interested to hear what everyone else has to say. Bye.
Hi Zoe, it's Catherine. Very quick and probably slightly disorganised voice memo about scrap organisation. Things I've done with my scraps in the past. I sell them on eBay, and I generally kind of batch them together as like wovens or stretch or, fancy, sequins, maybe things like that, and then say what it would be good for. So the wovens, I say, would be good for patchwork, and maybe the stretch things, I say, would be good for baby clothes or kids' clothes and things. And then I take a photograph of them all, and kind of, if they're woven, make sure that they're pressed and ironed so they look nice, so people can see the colours and what they're buying. And then I kind of measure each piece and find the smallest piece and say, these are all at least whatever the size of the smallest piece is, like A4 or A5 or like 50 by 50 centimetres, and then people know what they're getting. And I generally sort of say, like, what's the weight of the bag of scraps? And they always sell. I don't really care what they sell for. I would be quite happy to give them away for free, but I can't really work out a way to give scraps away for free and them go to a good home. I don't really have a kind of craft group or a youth group or anything, or a school near me that I can donate them to. So I've found that by selling them on eBay, they kind of go to somebody who actually wants them, and they usually sell for, like, I don't know, £1 or £2 for a kilogram bag, which I'm more than happy with, because it means that they're out of my house and being used by someone else. What else? Obviously, the other things that I do with my scraps is make them into quilts, and I don't really care whether they're jersey or woven or thick or thin or slippery or whatever. They all just get chucked into the quilt. So maybe you should say my quilts are a means of storing scraps rather than a means of using scraps. I don't know. Yeah, that's quite useful, I think, because then you can, like, if you have a kind of sentimental attachment to a scrap, then you can still have it there in your house, and kind of, if your quilt's on your bed or your sofa or whatever, then you can kind of have the memories still there with you. And I find, like, making quilts in itself is quite kind of restful, especially the hand stitching and stuff. But, I mean, how many quilts does any one person need? I have used scraps to stuff things, so I've made a tailor's ham. Well, I didn't make a tailor's ham. I've got a little drawstring bag that kind of was a cotton bag that I think a belt came in or a pair of shoes came in or something. And it was perfect for a tailor's ham, so I just stuffed it absolutely full with scraps till it couldn't stuff any more in, and then tied a knot in the drawstrings, and that was a tailor's ham, and it was exactly the right shape, and it has a nice kind of hammy shape about it. So I've done that, and I've used them to stuff, like a floor cushion thing, but honestly it turned into a cat bed and it's kind of grotty now. Well, that did get rid of some scraps. How I store the ones that I've got, I don't really have a system, I have to say. I've got a kind of bag for life thing that I keep them all in. They're all just shoved in there, they're not really organised anyway. And then I have a little drawer which has the kind of bigger woven pieces, maybe like kind of fat quarter sized, or big enough to be used for pocket linings and things. Or sometimes if I meet someone else who wants to like start quilting and they don't really have very much fabric, I usually would say, well, have some of mine, please take it off my hands. I mean, I don't approve of buying fat quarters because I just think they're such poor value, and there's so many scraps in the world anyway that why would you ever pay for them? So I've given a few people kind of like a starter pack of woven fabrics when they've wanted to start making quilts. That's all I can think of. Thanks for your podcast. Speak to you soon. Bye.
Hi, this is Alice from the Chicago area in the US. And a thing that I just did recently that used up a large number of scraps was I made, as many people have done, the closet core poof. But my twist on that is that I didn't make it for myself. I posted in a local sort of sustainability Facebook group that I would make it for someone. And so a number of people responded to my post, and I did a drawing, and the person I picked got fabric that they wanted the poof made out of, and I made it for them, and I stuffed it with my scraps. And so that's a thing that I'm thinking I might be able to do again in a couple of years when I have more that don't seem suitable for reuse.
Alice followed up to add some extra detail about this endeavour. She told me, when I made that poof, I didn't have enough scraps to completely fill the poof. I think I got it about 2/3 the way there. And I suggested to the recipient that they could solicit scraps from other folks in the community or use their own stained/torn/worn out clothes or household textiles to finish stuffing it. There were several other folks who offered up scraps on the original post, so this is a thing that one could do even without having a ton of scraps lying around. I hope that all of that has given you some ideas that you can apply to your own situation. We've got more ideas, approaches, uses and strategies in next week's episode, plus a hopefully useful summary that will help you put what will work for you.
Thanks so much for
into
listening.
action.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!